memories can be like shifting sands, and every time you look back on a stage in your life, you see it somewhat differently. And I was seeing it as a very incomplete picture. I had these deep feelings about my relationship with Bailey and everything that went wrong between us, and having the skin disease and my career finishing because of it. That was all very emotional, but I hadn't actually looked at it with a bit of distance and perspective.
Hello and welcome to The Big Interview. My guest today is Penelope Tree, often described as an icon of the swinging 60s, alongside fellow models Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton. She was photographed at 13 by Diane Arbus, and when she was 17, she attended Truman Capote's famous black and white ball, which effectively launched her career. She was spotted by the editor of American Vogue, Diana Vreeland, and photographed by Richard Avedon and Cecil Beaton. She became the muse of David Bailey, and the two had a tempestuous affair lasting several years until a skin condition effectively ended her career. Now, in her mid-70s, she lives in the English countryside and has just published a novel, Piece of My Heart, which, although fiction, closely mirrors her early career, describing a dizzying world of drugs, photo shoots and parties, a stormy relationship with a photographer, and a spiritual awakening. I'm Georgina Godwin, and I spoke to Penelope Tree on The Big Interview. Penelope Tree, welcome to The Big Interview. It's such a pleasure to meet you and have you here with me in the flesh in the studio.
Thank you, Georgina. I'm really pleased to be here.
Now, your book is called Piece of My Heart.
Yes.
And I am finding that there's very little difference between it and your life. What made you fictionalise what is essentially, I suppose, a memoir?
Well, it's not actually just a memoir. It is also very much a kind of piece of fiction because I had to condense quite a lot of the timeline. A lot of the characters, even though maybe one or two are very, very instantly recognizable, there are quite a lot who are composites as well. Basically, I've always loved reading fiction since the age of 3 or 4, and, still read a lot of fiction. I just wanted to explore that medium for myself, to see if I could do it, really.
Is it the first time you've written?
I've written pieces and I've tried to write novels several times, false starts, never really got anywhere. I had children and lots of kind of distractions.
Like a stellar modelling career, for instance. Yeah.
Well, no, that was only very early on. But when I had children and also sort of lived quite a peripatetic life, I was just always constantly distracted. And maybe I really hadn't reached that point in my life where I had really the insight about what was going on earlier on. And I wanted to explore that more. So I had a sort of a traumatic breakup of a long-term relationship in my early 60s. And so I found myself living in the country with a lot of time on my hands. And I thought, I can't any longer make excuses about why I'm not embarking on a book. So that's how it began.
You've done it, which is extraordinary. Now, I am doing that thing that British people do, although I'm not actually British, which is trying to place your accent.
Right.
Because, of course, your mother was Marietta Peabody Tree. She was a US socialite, a political activist. Your father was a British journalist and investor, and he was also a Conservative MP. So tell me about your parents and your early childhood.
So my father was born in 1897, so
Wow.
He was actually in his mid-50s when I was born. I was born in 1949, and he'd, been a Conservative MP during the war. He was close to Churchill, and then after the war, for various tax reasons, actually, he was being taxed tremendously after the Labour government got in, so he decided to move to New York with my mum, who he'd met 2 or 3 years before. She was American, and she was a very highly political animal, and so she was thrilled to go back to America where she could campaign for the Democrats and pursue her interests.
Was she very beautiful?
She was very beautiful in a very classical, almost Greek classical statue sort of way. Yeah.
And I mean, that can sometimes be a problem between mothers and daughters, can't it? When the mother is beautiful but feels herself aging. Was there ever that kind of conflict?
Well, unfortunately, there was a kind of conflict that went on very, very early between us. So I don't think it was very much to do with looks, although that might have come into it a bit later on. She was extremely accomplished in many ways. And she was also very highly social, interested in people, traveling, etc. She was not interested in babies and children. I had a wonderful nanny, luckily, but she would sort of fly into the nursery and say, darling, I'm going out to dinner in these sort of absolutely wonderful clothes. She dressed in Paris couture, and she would say, I'm off to dinner. I so wish that I could stay with you for dinner, but she didn't. And then she'd come back and sort of lay down the law. And I think I was quite bolshy and rebellious from an early age. And so we just clashed.
And do you think that's why they sent you to boarding school?
I went to a kind of progressive school in New York called Dalton, which was wonderful, very involved with the creative arts. And I was playing guitar with my best friend. We had a little group together. I had no talent in the music department whatsoever, but she was extremely talented. And we used to go down to Greenwich Village in sort of the, I guess, 1962 or 3 and play guitar on the fountain in Washington Square. And we were very keen on Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. We were then sort of invited to go to little clubs. And I think a friend of my mother's crossed the square one day and saw us and said, I hear Penelope is, singing in Washington Square. And I was suddenly transported to boarding school.
In Britain?
No, not in Britain, in New England.
And how was that experience?
That was not a great experience because, as I said, I've been to this progressive school where you could sort of pretty much do what you liked, which in my case was reading a lot and writing stories and playing music and things. Not a lot of emphasis on math and science or anything that you really, that if you didn't like it, you sort of didn't have to do it. Suddenly I was in this boarding school, which was extremely rigorous, and the main kind of focus was getting into an Ivy League college. I'd sort of floundered and also felt very depressed when I was 14, fell into a depression, which I'm not quite sure. I think it was because of many different elements that were going on at the time. I'd had a very unpleasant encounter with a much older man on a Greyhound bus and, sort of, sexual assault. And I never told anybody about it, but I've sort of transposed that into my book. Mm-hmm. And I think it had an enormous effect on my outlook at the time.
I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it, when you look back at the things that used to happen to women and we didn't say anything. How do you feel when you look at young women today and kind of analyse the whole Me Too movement? It's completely different, isn't it? And it's not that we didn't have the courage to come forward. It's just nobody cared.
Well, first of all, I didn't want to lose my freedom.
Yeah.
And I knew that if I told anybody what had happened, which I was given the kind of, this treat of going to see another friend of mine at a boarding school in Vermont. And so I went by myself on a bus, and it was, anyway, I won't go into it right now, but I just thought, well, I'll never be allowed to do that again. So, and also I compartmentalized the whole thing. So it didn't seem as important as all of that until actually quite recently. And then it really, I went through a kind of eureka. Well, no, I went through a sort of moment where I realized the effect that it had on me.
And do you think that came because you were writing about it? Was writing cathartic?
Yes, it was. It was definitely cathartic, but in a good way, because You know how memories can be like shifting sands, and every time you look back on a stage in your life, you see it somewhat differently. And I was seeing it as a very incomplete picture. I had these deep feelings about my relationship with Bailey and everything that went wrong between us, and having the skin disease and my career finishing because of it. That was all very emotional, but I hadn't actually looked at it in a sort of, with a bit of distance and perspective.
Well, I'd like to get into all of that, and particularly your career, because really it kind of started when you were 13.
Well, not really, no, because that was just a fluke.
Tell us what happened then, though.
So Diane Arbus was working for this rather sort of social magazine called Town and Country, which was mostly focused on debutantes, which is so odd to think that she was working for that magazine. And she came and took my picture. And at the time I was riding and was wearing the sort of, just come off sort of big morning on the horse. And I just was wearing the whole velvet cap and, tweed jacket. It was hot, boots, the whole thing. She made me lie in a field which was of stubble. It went on for 3 hours, this sitting, and I was hot and beside myself, and the picture was terrible. And my father took one look and said, absolutely not using that picture. So she said, can I come back? And I don't know why he said yes, but he did. And we went through the whole thing again, but in my parents' house, another 3 hours. It was quite a sort of intense experience because she was quite an intense woman. And the result speaks for itself, I think. I look pretty sort of pissed off.
And your parents were saying, no, you're not going to be a model.
Oh, well, there was never a sort of question of that. I didn't do it because I wanted to be a model, or she didn't take a photograph of me thinking I was going to be a model. It was just, I think it was girls, I hate to say it, so weird and tacky, but girls in society sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Adolescence. Mm-hmm. That had nothing to do with later becoming a model.
Well, and really the person that did was Truman Capote. What a wonderful phrase to be able to trot out. Truman Capote changed my life. Tell us how that happened.
Well, around the same age that I was when Diane Arbus took my photograph, I was crossing the hall in my parents' house. They were having a lunch party, and I just heard this outrageous voice that was very campy and very confident. I'd never heard anything like it. It was lisping. And I had read Truman Capote's earlier works because I loved him. And I'd also loved To Kill a Mockingbird, and I knew that he was a character in To Kill a Mockingbird. So I kind of put my head around the door. I don't know how it happened, but he saw me and we started talking. And I just said, I love your work so much, And of course, he liked that. A 12-year-old or something was saying that. So he said, do you write? Do you write? And I went, well, yes, I do, thinking the conversation would move on. And he said, I'd like to read what you've written. So I sent him, oh God, it's so embarrassing just to even think about it. But I sent him this short story and he sent me back a note saying, keep on working.
What was the story about? Do you remember?
I have no idea. Oh, it was about a woman who ate flowers. That's what she did. And she was a sort of widow who ate flowers. It was very surreal, I'm afraid.
Well, maybe that's your next book. I'm just so interested in what you said about his voice, and also that very accurate, if Tom Holland is to be believed, impression of it. Have you seen the new Truman Capote?
Yes.
And so, when you hear Holland's kind of interpretation of how he spoke, you think, wow, that's pretty over the top. But actually, you're saying that really is how he spoke. He nailed it.
It was the most shocking, because now we're used to outrageous voices and sort of people who look different and whatever. But he, at the time, was a freak. Yeah, let's face it. But the wonderful thing is, and Tom Holland really showed this so well, I think, is that he had this confidence. He didn't really give a damn what people thought. And so he held himself really well. and he was aware of how smart he was.
So did your relationship with Capote continue? I mean, were you a swan or perhaps a cygnet?
I was not a cygnet, no. We exchanged a couple of notes, and he wrote me once when I was at boarding school. And then when I was 16, I was so astonished and thrilled to get this invitation to the Black and White Ball.
Which, of course, is this huge party that was the biggest social event in New York.
It was a huge event, but I could never really quite understand why it was billed as such a huge thing, except that I think looking back on it, in retrospect, it was one of the first parties where sort of Hollywood met the New York social scene and the intellectuals and European kind of aristocracy. Everybody came. Lots of different people came. And so I think that's what made it special. And now a lot of parties are like that, but they weren't before. It was much more segregated.
And it was also, of course, the party where Penelope Tree met Cecil Beaton.
Yeah. I met Cecil Beaton. I was 16 at the time, and I knew very few people at the ball, and my parents were sort of, off chatting with various people. And so I wandered around feeling sort of invisible because of the mask that I was wearing.
What was your mask?
It was just like a black mask cut so that the points came down below my cheekbones sort of thing.
And your dress?
And the dress was black jersey with slits up the front and the sides. And it was based on dance clothes because I loved the Capizio store, which I think is still running. I always wore ballet shoes and Capizio leotards. So it was kind of like a play on that. And it was very simple, basically.
Well, you obviously looked completely gorgeous because you caught the eye of really two of the top photographers in the world.
I think it was because, simplicity often trumps lots of diamonds, feathers, tulle, etc.
And, of course, youth.
And hello, youth. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. So this now sort of really brings us on to another chapter, which is just being photographed by these incredibly famous photographers and really launching yourself into that world, a world that was already populated with people like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and various society people. But suddenly here you are the centre of attention. How did that feel to you? And how did that sort of going off on the runway, taking off into this fabulous career feel? Did you know that's where you were going?
I did not know, and it didn't feel like that because it's a very different world then to what it is now, because social media was not, things didn't sort of take off and become viral. I was still going to school and wanting to get into university. I was definitely going on a lot of go-sees and trying to get jobs, but half the people thought I was a total freak and looked ridiculous and would never use me. It was really only a few people who thought, that I looked unusual and wanted to photograph me.
Warhol.
And Warhol, yeah.
Tell us about your relationship with him.
Well, I don't know whether there's that much to tell because Andy was very, he pulled back and asked lots of questions of people. And then when you answered, he looked rather bored quite a lot of the time. So you tried to entertain him more. And so you told him more and more and more. And he sort of looked quite laconically. I really liked him a lot, but it was hard to have an actual relationship with him because he sort of wasn't, he was very present, but he didn't really engage. Not really.
The next chapter really is David Bailey and your time with him. How did you meet Bailey?
I was modelling, but at the same time I was still very interested in novels, books of any kind, and I got a job working in a publishing company in London called Rupert Hart Davies. It doesn't exist anymore. I was a reader for the summer. It was my first summer job. So it was 1967, Summer of Love, London, very exciting. So I don't know how much reading I got done because I was out every single night and having fantastic time. And I
mean, hanging out with people like, I don't know, John Lennon.
No, I wasn't hanging out with John Lennon. I'd love to say that I was, but it's just not true.
Although he did say that you were hot, 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 smart, didn't he?
I don't know. Well, you didn't say it to me. I would have been so chuffed. But yeah, I didn't know the Beatles at the time, and I would have loved to have known them. But I did meet lots of people in that summer that are still friends. So that's, I don't know, 50-something years
57
later.
years
yes,
later.
We have great friendships from that time. But,
and of course you forged this incredible bond with Bailey, albeit only for, 6 or 7 years?
Yes. So that summer I met Bea Miller, who was the editor of British Vogue, and she invited me to come into the office to meet a photographer. And I came in and opened the door, and there was Bailey sitting on the floor going through contact sheets or layouts or something. He saw me and he sort of sprang to his feet, and we had this extraordinary kind of, I don't know, just moment together. And it was like I kind of fell in love with him that moment, fatally, as it happens. But then he was married, so we had a very good photographic session, but that was it. I went home back to university, actually. And then I sort of knew that something was going to happen, and it did. A few months later, he came to New York, and we agreed to meet in Paris, and that was it for the next 5 or 6 years.
Why do you say fatally? Do you regret it?
I don't regret it. It was just a sort of not a very... I was going to university, and I'd say it was a very rigorous school of life that I chose to go through rather than, the usual academic channels. And I learned a lot, and we had wonderful travels together, and I still think that he's an extraordinary person and love him deeply. But being in that world where I was not making a lot of the decisions, and in fact... he was such a strong personality that I kind of lost my way, and I lost my center of gravity.
How did it end?
Well, I think that I was I fell into kind of depressions again. And instead of walking away when lots of women were throwing themselves at him and he was not discouraging them, let's put it that way, and I became very consumed with jealousy and unhappiness. And I thought I was meant to be his partner. But, I saw it in very simplistic terms, considering that it was the 60s. And I just thought that I was going to be with him forever. It was like that sort of love, And I really couldn't bear to face the truth. And so I developed this sort of cystic acne on my skin, on my face, and it really ended my career as a model, and it sort of ended my relationship with Bailey, ultimately.
So it was sort of like all of your emotions erupting out of the most precious thing you had. Well,
or what I thought was the precious thing. Yeah. So everything that I'd, the dreams that I'd realized at the age of quite a young age, 18, become a top model and met the man of my dreams and fell in love and had this actually amazing life. I lost it all within about 3 or 4 years. And of course, my parents had really disapproved of me being with a man who was 12 years older and had been married twice, and everybody warned me not to do it. And so it was really difficult because I didn't want to show them that they had been damn right.
Yeah.
So it was, I was in a difficult position.
Tell me about, when we talk about the 60s, we think about substances, for instance. That's one of the big things. And I know that there was a brush with the law to do with coke. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Well, and this is really true, but, you may or may not believe it, but there wasn't that much coke going around in 1971. And it was still pretty sort of rare to find people taking coke. And I was with a friend this dealer arrived. She said, I don't have any money. Will you buy some? And I bought a gram, and I looked into the bag of this dealer's, and I saw that he had all these little packages, maybe 100. I mean, filled to the brim, his Pan Am bag full of little packages of Coke. And I bought one, and then he left, and then I was feeling incredibly guilty and paranoid because, Coke was still quite rare, as I said. About 20 minutes later, 8 plainclothes men actually burst into the flat. My friend had a baby. Her mother was there. We were just sitting around chatting, and it was just terrifying. And they were, yelling and screaming because obviously they were after the dealer, and they got me instead. I didn't have any ID on me, and they didn't allow me a phone call. It was quite sort of interesting. Down at the police station, they just thought I was an old hippie or young hippie and threw me into the cell without a phone call. So I was there for some time, I don't know, overnight. They did not behave well. But the point is, it was actually quite a salutary experience for me because I did realize that it wasn't a place that I wanted to hang out. And I realized how much it would affect my father. In fact, I was on the front page of the Evening Standard with him, going into court. It was all very humiliating, but it was also an eye-opener. And I saw how many people actually at the time, it's ancient history now, but a lot of people were going to prison for 6 months for possession of half a joint, things like that. And it's hard to believe. So I joined this organization called Release, which helped people who were arrested with, small amounts of drugs to get a really good lawyer on legal aid to come and represent them in court. And that started changing the law quite a bit. It changed what was happening.
I mean, there's all these sort of tragic inflections in your life, but here you are, blooming in your 70s, and you've reinvented yourself, but multiple times. I mean, after that, you went off to Sydney.
Yeah, lived in Sydney for 17 years, and I think I was very lucky because it's not that easy these days to transport your family across the world and actually get a visa and things like that. But in those days, in the early 80s, it wasn't that much of a problem. So we had this adventure in Australia for a long time, which was wonderful. Loved it. Met up with some old friends from Oz magazine and designers and things like that. Became great friends with them, did a lot of road trips and worked for TV in Australia as a researcher. I think I've been lucky, as well as, having some difficult things happen.
All the way through the book, and indeed it would seem through your life, there is this very strong thread of Buddhism. Tell us about your spirituality.
Well, I had been searching for a very long time. Since the 60s, I became very interested in Hinduism and reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching. And I had gone to lots of lectures and met spiritual teachers, and sort of none of it had really stuck. I was interested, but it hadn't stuck until I reached the point where I thought, actually, it's up to the individual. It's not really about following a teacher or following a particular path. The individual has to find their own way. And then completely by fluke and unexpectedly, because I hadn't really ever thought about him very much, I met the Dalai Lama in New York in the early 90s. And his whole being had a profound effect on me. And I thought, I'm not going to jump into this like I've jumped into everything else that I've ever done. I'm going to go back to Australia, and I'm going to read as much as I can. And also, when Buddhist teachers come through Sydney, which they did a lot in those days, I'm going to go to everything. I also worked on the Australia-Tibet Council and worked on the Dalai Lama's tours because he came to Australia twice while I was there. And gradually, I sort of realized that this was the path that I felt most at home in, and that I was sort of just getting so much from, Yeah.
So when
Sorry
you think...
for these long answers.
Oh, it's fantastic.
I'm
And
so
thank you. You're
long-winded.
being so generous in your replies, and it's really wonderful to know. And I wonder, when you think of Penelope Tree, icon of the swinging 60s, is that something you identify with?
No, I do not, because, that is... It's just so subjective, isn't it? Some people thought I was great. Some people thought I was hideous. And I was very mixed up at the time and felt that I was a kind of, that I'd invented myself through makeup and clothes. And I didn't feel beautiful. So...
And yet it's extraordinary, because you are so very beautiful. You sit there radiantly. And I know that, in fact, as recently as, 2020, you were on the catwalk.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I think in fashion, these cycles come back, quicker and quicker and quicker. And I don't know. I'm just lucky to have encountered some of the designers in this era as well, and been very lucky to do those jobs. Yeah.
Tell me about your life now. How would you describe it day to day?
I live in the country. I live on an estate where they're rewilding the estate, which is very exciting because lots of things are happening there. It's not just a sort of rural idyll or anything. There are all kinds of ornithologists and butterfly experts and people from all kinds of different fields coming and talking. And it's a great place for an exchange of ideas. And I have been writing there and live a quite quiet life, except I come to London a couple of days a week and see friends. And
can we hang out?
Yeah. Yes, please. Well, you have to come to visit in the country as well.
Are you single? That's not me coming on to you, by the way. Are you single?
I am single.
And how does that
Happily.
feel? That's a good thing.
Well, that's how I started writing, is I broke up with a long-term partner when I was about 62 and traveled around a couple of years, couldn't think what I was doing. This opportunity came up to live in the country in Sussex. So I went, not having ever lived for even more than a week outside of the city. And it was just exactly what I needed. And it's there that I could do my Buddhist practice, I could write, I could read, and also sort through all these things that had happened to me and try and make some sense of it. Yeah.
In your book, Piece of My Heart, in the very last chapter, the protagonist, Ariadne, goes to Nepal to attend the teachings of a revered Buddhist Lama. Mm-hmm. She reconnects with Tenzin. She feels a strong attraction to him. She reflects on her past experiences and she contemplates her future path. What's your future path?
Well, I would love to write another book. I have all kinds of ideas, but I haven't really quite embarked on it yet. I hope to keep traveling and spend lots of time with my kids traveling as well. The kids, they're both adults, old adults. And I think that, obviously this is something we can't really predict what's going to happen, but I love my life, actually. I really do. And so I hope that I can keep on upright long enough to enjoy it a bit more. But...
So your next book has absolutely got to be about a woman who eats flowers, because then you can actually get a line from Truman Capote. You could quote his letter back to you saying, keep writing, Truman Capote. It will be a bestseller, I promise you. But I'm sure that Piece of My Heart will be too. Penelope, it's been such a joy to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. I've really enjoyed it.
And that's it for this edition of The Big Interview. It was produced by Gunnar Grunlid and edited by Jack Dewars. From me, Georgina Godwin, thanks very much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.